I'm chairing this afternoon's the final session of the conference because unfortunately Friederike van Havalt can't be here because of a family bereavement. So it falls to me to chair this last session. We need to keep to time. You've heard about how tight the time frame is afterwards, and how we all have to be on parade at the for the final dinner. So this session is continuing the theme of investing in conservation, and I'm going to go straight into briefly introducing our first speaker, Gregory Vogt of Conservation Gardens South Africa, who's going to talk about the Conservation Achievement Score Project. Gregory.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you very much to EAZA for the opportunity to present here today. Some thank yous also go to the collaboration agreements that Conservation Guardians has proudly forged with the National Zoological Gardens in South Africa. They're a EAZA member, the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and Sicilian Mfolozi Park, and then Padova University in Italy. As you've known, my name is Greg Vogt, and my introduction to your world of zoological gardens and aquaria has been through Parque Natura Viva, and it's been a grateful journey for me, and I've really appreciated getting to know your community. The conversation that I'm going to be having with you for the next 10 minutes starts with the IUCN biodiversity targets, and I'm assuming that you all know what those targets are. And each country is required to adopt those targets, design the mechanisms to adopt those targets. And in South Africa, we have very, very strong mechanisms adopting those targets. However, the data is lacking. And it was interesting speaking to Sam earlier, where I mentioned I'll be focusing on private sector land. And he said, no, you've also got to look at the formal sector as well, the state land, because that data is not as accurate as it should be. Coming back to your world, you have a very clear commitment to biodiversity conservation, and it's clearly defined in principles. But when we get to the UNWTO, the World Tourism Organization, there is intention written into their documentation, but there's a disconnect between tourism and conservation. And I don't know if many of you identify with that, but I experience it on a daily basis, and I am literally in situ, deep and in situ. So the Conservation Achievement Score has been born from my involvement speaking to many of your visitors and identifying that your visitors undergo your education programs, but when they get into our world, it doesn't seem to be translating effectively, but there are other reasons as well. We will all adopt the assumption that the consumer demand for wildlife experience is significant. There's 700 million people that go through your doors annually worldwide, and the UNWTO report brags of 1.2 million or 1.2 billion people that are tourists annually. But 12 million of those are directed to wildlife tourism in Africa. And again, I'm going to move towards highlighting the disconnect between tourism and conservation. Both organizations recognize the consumer value of the visitor for biodiversity conservation. But the question I ask is, how do we channel this consumer resource potential to benefit biodiversity conservation targets? I take excerpts of your documentation and your meetings, and again, you reference meeting the Aichi targets. But whilst there's commitment on the UNWTO side, I don't see any firm conversion. I still need to be convinced on the tourism side. They're talking conservation, biodiversity, and a commitment, but I'm not seeing it. So this global commitment towards biodiversity conservation has been further adjusted by IUCN documentation and work, and they've recognized that to achieve their biodiversity targets, we have to extend options into private land. South African biodiversity legislation has responded, the machinery has responded to this call through a national protected area expansion strategy. It's all fancy words, but it is making a difference. 80% of our land is privately or communally owned, and when I talk about privately owned land, please understand that that includes community land as well. There's a traditional leadership system in South Africa, and it exists in Namibia, in Zimbabwe, and Mozambique, and many of the other places as well. So we refer to this program as biodiversity stewardship, and there are some other mechanisms that are very similar, but the bottom line is that if you are a private landowner, or if you have community land, and it is a biodiversity hotspot, you can proclaim it as a nature reserve through the mechanisms available and through the stewardship program, and that then contributes towards the targets that get sent to the IUCN. So recently, for the 5 provinces, the provinces that are highlighted in blue, all of those targets were achieved through the stewardship, the biodiversity stewardship. Between 2008 and 2016, 830,000 hectares were added to the protected area state, improving protection for threatened biomes. And these biomes, they're fynbos biomes, it's a World Heritage concept, savanna, grassland, there's a variety of it. And again, biodiversity stewardship plays a major role. Keep in mind this 1.2 million hectare number, because if we look at that 2008 and 2016 period, the 68% of that, 564,000 of the 830,000 hectares comes from biodiversity. That's 1/3. Comes from stewardships, and that is 1/3 of the Kruger Park. So the mechanism, the stewardship mechanism is working, but this is very, very interesting. They refer to incentives. So if you've got private land, the incentives include tax rebates and a variety of other incentives, but there's no tourism incentive to that land, to that declared land. So I'd like to just expand on those figures a little bit, and I should take my sip of water. I'm much more comfortable in the bush when there's a rhino around the corner and I'm taking European university students around. But this national register is what is given to the IUCN in terms of the targets. And you can see that there's 7.9 million hectares of state land, and 1.2 million of that is stewardships. But this is where it becomes interesting. There's 12.7 million hectares of private protected land available. And this is where I ask the question, why is it so difficult to convert this 12.7 million into a stewardship or proclaim it as private, or proclaim it as a nature reserve, if they meet and qualify for stewardships? So, especially when you're considering that it's 70 to 400 times cheaper to establish the space in private land, 4 to 17 times cheaper to manage than state-owned protected areas. And then, this is quite a shocking figure, 80% of the country's most scarce and threatened habitats are privately owned. So once again, I come to that incentive. There is currently no grading or indicator that directs tourists or explains to tourists to places of high conservation integrity. And I'm going to present something to you, and I don't know how many of you have ever been tourists in South Africa or Southern Africa, but I'm sure those of you who have traveled around the world, the people that I've spoken to here who have, are working in other places, rural places or third world places, they basically concur. This is an extract of some of the marketing gumph that you'll get. And one of these places has a stewardship, and the other one is pretty much just a safari park. When I say just a safari park, I mean it really is a tourism trap. And this is where we ask the question whether tourism demand is shaping the moral compass of biodiversity conservation. Through the proposed conservation achievement score, zoos can now directly participate in shaping biodiversity conservation towards achieving global targets. And currently the consumer makes their decision on the marketing content of that place. So your only decision, or the tourist's only decision, is the marketing content that they face. But the conservation achievement score, and it's an accreditation that guides the travel trade towards places, which is pretty self-explanatory. If you can imagine a decal that indicates to the travel trade places that there's a standard of conservation integrity. And then the proposed strategy is to go to the travel trade and to the consumer and educate them about this. It does have a few conversion opportunities, and this does break that disconnect between tourism and conservation efforts. The grading of the conservation integrity or private protected areas is needed so that we can integrate the interdisciplinary efforts towards these IHE targets. And that will be done through this score. So this initiative provides an opportunity for in-situ facilities and ex-situ facilities to work hand in hand towards global biodiversity targets. And this is really the crux of us taking hands with the important work that you do. And there's no standard that is currently jointly defined by yourselves and the your in-situ partners. Sadly, the travel trade have defined and are currently defining their own standards. There's the APTA standards, I know there's Dutch standards, but they've never consulted with us, and I don't think they've consulted with the zoological garden and aquaria fraternity. And I think, in my opinion, that's because the conservation community has failed to establish a professional body. You speak of yourselves as being conservation practitioners, but what defines you as a professional conservation practitioner? And that is why we are recommending that we go into a few actions to achieve this. So the actions are to engage with EAZA Switzerland, which we've already started doing, and we've already started engaging with the South African National Biodiversity Institute. Our next step, once the SANBI Act has been done, we'll then move on to the Department of Environment and the Department of Tourism, and then we'll introduce the concept to the Grading Council again, which we originally did in 2016. Our regional meetings with private landowners is part of the process, and then constituting a professional body is very important. I don't want to dwell on this too much, but there is a need, and it's been endorsed by the Wilderness Foundation CEO, and the costs of this process will amount to 62,000 euros. We're inviting EAZA and their members to participate in this pilot project with a view to making this a global standard. We will ask that you can consider an MOU with us, and that mandate is to initiate the ISO standard. We can't go to Switzerland without having a mandate, and we're asking your body to partner with us to get that mandate. It's a 3-year project, and it stipulates that the pilot project takes place in South Africa. But land tenure is like driving on the roads. Some places you drive on the left-hand side, some places you drive on the right-hand side, but we all know how to drive a car, and we all make it at the end of the day. We need to register this professional body of conservation practitioners to develop and manage the standards. So every 2 years, those standards are constantly looked at. And I'm sure all of you will know there's electrical consulting engineering standards. The concept of a professional body is a global concept. And the project provides EAZA and their members the opportunity to participate directly in in-situ research planning, which I know you're doing already, and conservation education initiatives. But a key aspect of this, it gives you credibility from in-situ back. So the tourist, the consumer, is seeing your work being bragged about through that decal that guides them to places of conservation integrity. I believe it's a unique opportunity, and I hope that you do, and some of the people that I've been speaking to have highlighted this. And it's been presented or spoken about as an unprecedented case and an opportunity for in situ and ex situ conservationists to partner in establishing this ranking for visitors and tourists to invest their tourism spend to places of high conservation integrity. The initiative provides EAZA and their members the opportunity to present themselves as significant stakeholders in situ conservation. I know you are significant stakeholders already. All these presentations have highlighted that. But we would all agree that the message cannot be told enough, and this is one platform that I think can make a difference. To me, during this conference, I've witnessed so many people presenting on the little animals that are important. And you have something in common with those places, those conservation places that have stewardships and have proclaimed their land as nature reserves. And they've got all the little things, but they don't have the big lion to attract the tourist. So if you can imagine arriving in a country like South Africa or any other country in that world, and the decal says that this place is a place of high conservation integrity, and it doesn't have to promote it through a lion or a tiger or an elephant. So thank you very much. And again, thank you to Parque Natura Viva for your sponsorship of my trip to South Africa. No questions.
Thank you, Greg. We don't have time for questions, so